In the summer of 1969, a freight train carrying $2.6 million in federal currency disappeared into the fog of Northern California and emerged empty. No violence, no witnesses, no trace. The money vanished as if it had never existed, leaving investigators with nothing but questions and a case file that would gather dust for half a century. But sometimes the past refuses to stay buried. In 2019, a routine estate auction in Sacramento featured an unremarkable lot of vintage luggage and office supplies. Hidden among the forgotten items was a weathered leather briefcase, its brass latches tarnished with age. What it contained wasn't money, but something far more dangerous to those who thought they had escaped justice decades ago. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The briefcase held documents that would crack open one of the most perfectly executed train robberies in American history. A crime so clean, so methodical, that federal agents had called it impossible to solve. Yet 50 years later, a single forgotten object would prove that even the most carefully planned crimes leave traces. And those traces, no matter how small, eventually find their way back to the surface. On the morning of August 14, 1969, Southern Pacific Railroad locomotive number 4387 pulled a consist of 12 freight cars through the rolling hills of Yolo County. The train was bound for Los Angeles, carrying a mixed cargo of agricultural equipment, manufactured goods, and one very special car. The third car from the engine was a reinforced mail car, painted regulation green with steel-barred windows and a single side door secured with federal locks. Inside that car sat $2.6 million in crisp bills, packed in canvas bags and locked in steel strongboxes. The money represented tax collections from the Northern California region, being transported to the Federal Reserve Bank in Los Angeles for processing. It was a routine transfer, one that had been conducted hundreds of times before without incident. The route was well established, the security protocols tested, and the schedule precise. The train departed Sacramento at 6:42 a.m., following a path that would take it through Davis, then south through the Central Valley. The crew consisted of 4 railroad employees: engineer Frank Morrison, conductor Bill Hayes, and 2 mail guards, Thomas Chen and Robert Valdez. Both guards were armed federal employees with spotless records and years of experience handling high-value transfers. At 8:15 a.m., the train made its scheduled stop in Davis to take on water and perform a routine inspection. The stop lasted exactly 12 minutes. During that time, the mail car remained locked and under guard. No one approached the car, no one entered or exited, and the guards reported nothing unusual. The train resumed its journey at 8:27 a.m., disappearing into the morning haze as it continued south. What happened next would baffle investigators for decades. The train was scheduled to arrive in Fresno at 11:30 a.m. for a brief stop before continuing to Los Angeles. When it pulled into the Fresno yard, everything appeared normal. The locomotive was running smoothly. The cars were properly coupled, and the crew was at their posts. But when railroad officials unlocked the mail car for a routine inspection, they found something that defied explanation. The car was empty. The steel strongboxes were gone, the canvas bags had vanished. Even the wooden shipping crates that had held additional paperwork were missing. The car looked as if it had been swept clean, leaving only the metal floor and bare walls. Yet the car showed no signs of forced entry. The locks were intact, the windows unbroken, and the single side door remained securely fastened from the inside. The 2 guards were found unconscious on the floor, their hands bound with industrial rope and their mouths sealed with tape. When they regained consciousness, neither could remember what had happened. Both reported feeling dizzy and disoriented during the journey, but assumed it was motion sickness from the swaying car. The last thing they remembered was checking their watches around 9:30 a.m., somewhere between Davis and Merced. Medical examination revealed that both guards had been drugged with chloral hydrate, a sedative that would have rendered them unconscious within minutes. The drug had been administered through their morning coffee, which they had consumed from a thermos brought aboard in Sacramento. Someone had access to their coffee, but how that person had entered and exited the locked car remained a mystery. The FBI took control of the investigation within hours. Special Agent Margaret Torres arrived from San Francisco with a team of forensic specialists, and what they found only deepened the puzzle. The mail car had been meticulously cleaned. No fingerprints, no footprints, no fibers from clothing or gloves. Even the rope used to bind the guards was standard railroad issue, available at any supply depot. The thermos that had contained the drugged coffee was examined thoroughly. It showed no foreign substances other than the chloral hydrate, and the coffee itself was a common brand sold throughout California. The drug had been mixed professionally, with just enough concentration to incapacitate the guards without causing permanent harm. This suggested someone with medical or chemical knowledge, but that lead proved fruitless as hundreds of people in the region had access to such substances. Investigators focused on the logistics of the crime. How had someone entered a locked, moving train car, removed over a ton of money and strong boxes, and escaped without being detected? The windows were too small for human passage, and the single door could only be opened from the inside. Yet somehow, the impossible had occurred. The first theory centered on an inside job. Both guards underwent intensive questioning, polygraph tests, and background investigations. Their finances were scrutinized, their associates interviewed, and their movements tracked for months prior to the robbery. Both men emerged clean. No suspicious deposits, no unusual contacts, no signs of preparation for such a crime. The train crew was similarly investigated. Engineer Morrison had worked for Southern Pacific for 18 years with an unblemished record. Conductor Hayes was a family man with 3 children and a mortgage, showing no signs of sudden wealth or suspicious behavior. Both men had been in the locomotive cab throughout the journey, visible to anyone who might have observed the train's passage. The second theory involved a sophisticated operation using the train's scheduled stops. Investigators calculated that the crime had occurred between the Davis stop and the Discovery in Fresno, a window of approximately 3 hours. During that time, the train had made no unscheduled stops and had been observed by multiple witnesses along the route. Yet none of those witnesses reported seeing anything unusual. Railroad records showed that the train had passed through 17 crossings, 6 small towns, and numerous farms and ranches. Teams of agents interviewed hundreds of people who lived or worked along the route. No one had seen anyone boarding or leaving the train. No one had witnessed unusual activity around the tracks. The train had moved through the valley like a ghost, leaving no trace of the crime that had occurred aboard. The third theory was the most troubling. The money had been removed during the Davis stop, despite the guards' vigilance. This would have required precise timing, knowledge of the guards' routines, and access to the rail yard. It would also have required a team of people to move the heavy strongboxes quickly and quietly. Investigators descended on Davis, interviewing every railroad employee, every person who had been in the yard that morning, and every business owner in the vicinity. They examined every vehicle that had entered or left the area, every truck that could have carried the stolen money, and every building that could have concealed it. The search yielded nothing. The case began to take on an almost supernatural quality. How do you steal $2.6 million from a locked, moving train without leaving a trace? How do you drug 2 armed guards, remove over a ton of materials, and vanish into thin air? The FBI had handled train robberies before, but nothing like this. As weeks turned to months, the investigation expanded. Agents traced every bill in the stolen shipment, monitoring banks and businesses across California for any sign of the money entering circulation. They investigated known criminals with the skills and resources to pull off such a heist. They examined similar crimes in other states, looking for patterns or connections. The money never surfaced. No bills were detected in circulation, no suspicious deposits were made, and no one began spending beyond their means. It was as if the $2.6 million had simply ceased to exist. The FBI began to suspect that the money had been destroyed or hidden so well that it might never be found. By 1971, the active investigation had been scaled back. The case remained open, but with no new leads and no evidence to pursue, it was relegated to the cold case files. The stolen money was written off by the Federal Reserve, and the insurance companies paid their claims. The case became a curiosity, studied in law enforcement academies as an example of the perfect crime. But the perfect crime, as investigators would learn 50 years later, was anything but perfect. It had left a trail, hidden but not destroyed, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And that moment came not through brilliant detective work or advanced forensics, but through the simple act of cleaning out an old man's garage. The briefcase that would crack the case wide open had been sitting in a storage unit in Sacramento for decades, forgotten among boxes of old papers and personal effects. When Harold Brennan died in 2018 at the age of 91, his estate included dozens of items that no one in his family recognized or understood. The briefcase was one of them, unremarkable except for its age and the fact that it was locked. Brennan had been a railroad employee for 43 years, working various jobs from track maintenance to freight coordination. He had retired in 1986 and lived quietly in a small house near the railroad yard where he had spent most of his career. His family knew little about his work life, and he had rarely spoken about his years with the railroad. When Brennan's nephew sorted through his uncle's belongings, he found the briefcase in a closet, buried under old clothing and railroad memorabilia. The nephew, thinking it might contain important documents or family papers, tried to open it. The lock was old but sturdy, and after several attempts he decided to include it in the estate auction rather than force it open. The briefcase sat in the auction house for 3 months, part of a lot that included vintage luggage, office supplies, and miscellaneous items from Brennan's estate. The lot was priced to sell quickly, and most potential buyers were interested in the more obvious, valuable items. The briefcase, with its worn leather and tarnished hardware, attracted little attention. On a rainy Saturday morning in March 2019, the lot was purchased by David Chen, a Sacramento antique dealer who specialized in vintage office equipment and railroad memorabilia. Chen had been drawn to the auction by several other items in Brennan's estate, including an old railroad lantern and some vintage timetables. The briefcase was simply part of the package. Chen transported the lot to his shop and began sorting through the items. The briefcase intrigued him, both for its craftsmanship and its mysterious locked condition. Unlike his nephew, Chen had the tools and patience to open old locks without damaging them. Using techniques learned from years of dealing with vintage items, he carefully worked the mechanism until it clicked open. Inside the briefcase, Chen found documents that would change everything. The papers were old, yellowed with age, but still legible. There were train schedules, route maps, and what appeared to be detailed notes about railroad operations. But it was the handwritten journal that caught Chen's attention, and the photographs that made his blood run cold. The journal contained entries dating from 1968 and 1969, written in a careful hand that described train schedules, guard routines, and security procedures. The entries were methodical, almost scientific in their attention to detail. They described the best locations for observing trains, the timing of various operations, and the habits of different crew members. But it was the entry dated August 12, 1969, that made Chen realize what he had stumbled upon. The entry described a plan, written in clinical detail, for boarding a moving train and removing its cargo. The plan was sophisticated, requiring precise timing, specialized equipment, and intimate knowledge of railroad operations. It was the blueprint for what would become known as the silent train robbery. The photographs were even more damning. They showed the interior of a mail car, taken from angles that suggested the photographer had been inside during transport. There were images of strongboxes, canvas bags, and security equipment. Most shocking of all was a photograph of two unconscious men, clearly the drugged guards, lying on the floor of the mail car. Chen stared at the contents of the briefcase, understanding that he held evidence of one of the most famous unsolved crimes in California history. The silent train robbery had been the subject of books, documentaries, and countless theories. Now, 50 years later, the truth had literally fallen into his hands. The next morning, Chen called the FBI. The call that David Chen made to the FBI Sacramento field office on that March morning in 2019 would reignite the most perplexing train robbery case in American history. Special Agent Lisa Rodriguez, who had been handling cold cases for the Bureau, initially approached Chen's claim with skepticism. Train robbery hoaxes were not uncommon, and the silent train robbery had attracted its share of conspiracy theorists and attention seekers over the decades. But when Chen described the contents of the briefcase in detail, Rodriguez's interest sharpened. The specificity of the documents, the quality of the photographs, and the fact that they had emerged from the estate of a longtime railroad employee created a compelling narrative that couldn't be dismissed. Within hours, Rodriguez was sitting in Chen's antique shop, examining the briefcase and its contents with the methodical precision of someone who had spent years chasing ghosts. The journal was the key piece of evidence. Written in blue ink that had faded to a pale gray, the entries spanned nearly 2 years of planning and observation. The handwriting was consistent throughout, suggesting a single author who had maintained meticulous records of his activities. The early entries, dating from late 1968, were exploratory in nature, describing different train routes, security procedures, and the general operations of the Southern Pacific Railroad. As Rodriguez read through the entries, a picture emerged of someone with extraordinary patience and attention to detail. The author had spent months learning the rhythms of the railroad, noting which trains carried valuable cargo, when security was lightest, and how the various systems operated. The entries revealed an intimate knowledge of railroad operations that could only have come from someone working within the system. The entry, dated January 15, 1969, marked a turning point in the planning. The author had identified the regular currency transfers from Sacramento to Los Angeles, noting that they occurred every 6 to 8 weeks and always followed the same route. The entry described the security protocols in clinical detail, including the number of guards, their typical routines, and the specific procedures for handling the strongboxes. But it was the technical aspects of the plan that truly impressed Rodriguez. The author had solved the seemingly impossible problem of entering a locked, moving train car through a combination of engineering knowledge and criminal ingenuity. The solution, as described in the journal, was both elegant and terrifying in its simplicity. The plan centered on Harold Brennan himself, the railroad employee whose estate had yielded the briefcase. Brennan had worked in freight coordination, a position that gave him access to train schedules, cargo manifests, and security protocols. More importantly, his job required him to board trains regularly to inspect cargo and verify shipments. His presence on any train would be completely normal and unremarkable. The journal revealed that Brennan had been planning the robbery for over a year, studying every aspect of the operation with the thoroughness of a military strategist. He had identified the specific mail car that would be used for the August 14th transfer, had obtained duplicate keys through his position, and had even practiced the timing of his movements during previous routine inspections. The entry, dated August 10, 1969, 4 days before the robbery, contained the final details of the plan. Brennan would board the train in Davis during the scheduled stop, hiding in a utility compartment near the mail car. Once the train was moving, he would use his keys to enter the mail car, drug the guards with chloral hydrate mixed into their coffee, and then systematically remove the money in strongboxes. The logistics of moving over a ton of stolen money from a moving train had been solved through careful preparation. Brennan had arranged for the money to be transferred to a second train car, one carrying legitimate freight that would be uncoupled at a small depot south of Merced. The stolen money would be hidden among legitimate cargo, allowing it to be transported to its final destination without detection. The photographs in the briefcase supported every detail of the journal entries. There were images of the mail car's interior, showing the exact placement of the strongboxes and the positions where the guards typically stood. The photographs had been taken during previous routine inspections, when Brennan's presence would have been completely normal. Most damning of all was a photograph taken during the robbery itself. It showed the 2 unconscious guards lying on the floor of the mail car, their hands already bound with rope. The image was time-stamped August 14, 1969, at 9:47 a.m., placing it exactly within the window when the crime had occurred. Rodriguez carefully cataloged every item in the briefcase, photographing each document and securing them as evidence. The journal alone contained enough information to reconstruct the entire robbery, but it was the supporting materials that would prove crucial to the investigation. There were maps of the railroad route, diagrams of the mail car's interior, and detailed notes about the timing of various operations. Among the papers was a list of names and addresses, apparently associates who had helped with different aspects of the plan. The list included mechanics who had modified equipment, drivers who had transported materials, and even a chemist who had provided the chloral hydrate. Most intriguingly, there was a name circled in red ink: Marcus Webb, identified as the inside man at the depot where the stolen money had been transferred. The briefcase also contained financial records that traced the movement of the stolen money after the robbery. The $2.6 million had been divided among several accounts, laundered through a series of legitimate businesses, and gradually converted into real estate and other investments. The records showed a level of financial sophistication that suggested professional money laundering expertise. One document, dated September 1969, described the final disposition of the stolen funds. The money had been used to purchase a series of properties in Nevada and Arizona, all held under false names and shell companies. The properties were then sold over a period of years, with the profits reinvested in legitimate businesses. By 1975, according to the records, the original $2.6 million had been completely laundered and integrated into the legal economy. The most shocking revelation came in the final pages of the journal. Brennan had not acted alone, and the robbery had not been a one-time event. The journal described a sophisticated criminal organization that had been operating for years, using railroad employees to steal cargo and currency shipments across the western United States. The silent train robbery had been just one operation in a much larger criminal enterprise. As Rodriguez studied the documents, she realized that the case was far more complex than anyone had imagined. The FBI had been looking for a single dramatic heist, but what they had actually encountered was a systematic criminal operation that had been stealing from railroads for decades. The organization had been so successful at avoiding detection that many of their crimes had never even been reported as robberies. The journal entries described at least 6 other major thefts between 1967 and 1972, each involving different railroad routes and different types of cargo. The organization had stolen everything from valuable manufactured goods to government bonds, always using the same basic method of having railroad employees facilitate the thefts from within the system. The investigation that followed Chen's discovery would eventually reveal the full scope of the criminal enterprise. Using the names and addresses from Brennan's briefcase, the FBI was able to identify dozens of people who had been involved in the operation. Some were dead, others had disappeared, but several were still alive and living under their real names, apparently confident that their crimes would never be discovered. The breakthrough came when agents located Marcus Webb, the inside man mentioned in Brennan's journal. Webb was 78 years old and living in a retirement community in Phoenix, Arizona. When confronted with the evidence from the briefcase, he initially denied any involvement in the robbery, but faced with the detailed records and photographs, he eventually agreed to cooperate with the investigation. Webb's confession filled in the remaining pieces of the puzzle. He had been working as a freight supervisor at the depot where the stolen money had been transferred to the second train car. His job had been to ensure that the car carrying the hidden money was uncoupled at the right location and diverted to a private siding where Confederates could retrieve it. The money had been removed from the train car under cover of darkness, loaded into trucks, and transported to a warehouse in Stockton. From there, it had been divided and distributed to various members of the organization according to a predetermined plan. Brennan, as the mastermind of the operation, had received the largest share, but everyone involved had been well compensated for their participation. Webb's confession also revealed the fate of the other members of the organization. Several had died of natural causes over the years, while others had moved away and lost contact with the group. The organization had gradually dissolved as its members aged and retired, but the profits from their crimes had continued to benefit them for decades. The discovery of Brennan's briefcase had not only solved the silent train robbery, but had exposed an entire criminal network that had operated undetected for years. The case demonstrated how sophisticated criminals could use their knowledge of legitimate systems to commit crimes that appeared impossible to solve. For the FBI, the case represented both a triumph and a sobering reminder of the limitations of traditional investigative methods. The robbery had been solved not through brilliant detective work or advanced forensics, but through the simple fact that one of the criminals had kept detailed records of his activities. Had Brennan destroyed the briefcase or hidden it more carefully, the truth might never have emerged. The investigation also revealed how the passage of time had worked in favor of the criminals. By 2019, most of the stolen money had been laundered so thoroughly that it was impossible to trace or recover. The properties purchased with the stolen funds had been sold and resold multiple times, making it legally impossible to seize them. The criminals had literally gotten away with murder, saved only by the fact that murder had not been part of their crimes. As Rodriguez compiled her final report on the case, she reflected on the strange chain of events that had led to its resolution. A man dies, his family cleans out his belongings, an antique dealer buys a mysterious briefcase, and 50 years of silence are shattered by the simple act of curiosity. The case had been solved by accident, a reminder that even the most carefully planned crimes can be undone by the most unexpected circumstances. The silent train robbery had finally been solved, but the solution raised as many questions as it answered. How many other crimes had the organization committed? How much money had they stolen over the years? And most importantly, how many other criminal enterprises were operating in plain sight, protected by the simple fact that no one suspected they existed? The answers to those questions would emerge gradually over the following months, as the FBI worked through the mountain of evidence contained in Harold Brennan's briefcase. What they discovered was a criminal organization that had been far more successful and far-reaching than anyone had imagined. The financial records revealed that the organization had stolen an estimated $47 million over a 15-year period, making it one of the most successful criminal enterprises in American history. They had operated with the precision of a legitimate business, maintaining detailed records, paying taxes on their laundered income, and even contributing to retirement accounts in charitable organizations. The most remarkable aspect of their operation was how they had hidden in plain sight. All of the key members had maintained their legitimate jobs while conducting their criminal activities. Brennan had continued working for the railroad until his retirement in 1986, never raising suspicion despite having orchestrated multiple major thefts. His personnel file showed him to be a model employee, punctual, reliable, and trusted with sensitive cargo operations. The organization's success had been built on a simple principle: steal from the system by using the system itself. They had identified the weaknesses in railroad security not through external observation, but through intimate knowledge gained from working within the industry. They knew which trains carried valuable cargo, when security was lightest, and how to move stolen goods without detection because they were part of the very system they were exploiting. Special Agent Rodriguez's investigation revealed that the organization had been responsible for at least 12 major thefts between 1967 and 1975. In addition to the silent train robbery, they had stolen government bonds worth $8.3 million, jewelry shipments valued at $12.7 million, and even a shipment of newly minted coins worth $6.2 million. Each theft had been meticulously planned and flawlessly executed, leaving investigators with no evidence and no suspects. The case files from these earlier thefts showed a pattern of confusion and frustration among law enforcement. The crimes had been so clean, so professional, that investigators had struggled to understand how they had been committed. In several cases, the thefts had not been discovered for days or even weeks, giving the criminals ample time to launder their proceeds and cover their tracks. Marcus Webb's continued cooperation proved invaluable in understanding the full scope of the operation. During extensive interviews, he revealed that the organization had included more than 20 people at its peak, including railroad employees, truck drivers, warehouse workers, and even a corrupt FBI agent who had provided inside information about federal investigations. The corrupt agent, identified as Special Agent David Morrison, had retired from the FBI in 1978 and died in 2003. His involvement explained why the organization had been so successful at avoiding detection. Morrison had provided advance warning of investigations, helped to misdirect FBI resources, and even falsified evidence to protect the organization's activities. His betrayal had been so complete that he had essentially made the criminals untouchable. Webb also revealed the fate of the stolen money from the silent train robbery. The $2.6 million had been divided among 7 people, with Harold Brennan receiving the largest share of $800,000. The money had been laundered through a complex network of shell companies and legitimate businesses, gradually converted into real estate, stocks, and other investments. By the time of Brennan's death in 2018, his share of the stolen money had grown to an estimated $3.2 million through careful investment and reinvestment. The money had purchased his home, funded his retirement, and even paid for his grandchildren's college educations. None of his family had ever suspected that their comfortable lifestyle had been built on the proceeds of crime. The investigation also revealed how the organization had eventually dissolved. The death of corrupt FBI agent Morrison in 2003 had eliminated their protection from federal investigation. Several key members had died of natural causes, while others had grown nervous about the risks of continued criminal activity. By 2005, the organization had effectively ceased operations, its members scattering to enjoy their ill-gotten gains in quiet retirement. The case presented unique challenges for federal prosecutors. The statute of limitations had long since expired on all of the thefts, making criminal prosecution impossible. Even if the criminals could be charged, most of the stolen money had been laundered so thoroughly that it was legally impossible to recover. The criminals had not only gotten away with their crimes, but had profited from them for decades. The only legal action taken was the seizure of Harold Brennan's estate, which was valued at approximately $2.1 million. Federal prosecutors argued that the entire estate represented proceeds from criminal activity and should be forfeited to the government. Brennan's family fought the seizure, claiming they had no knowledge of his criminal activities and should not be punished for his crimes. The legal battle over Brennan's estate highlighted the complex moral questions raised by the case. His family had lived comfortable lives funded by stolen money, but they had been completely unaware of the source of their prosperity. His grandchildren had attended college on scholarships funded by criminal proceeds, but they had earned their degrees through legitimate hard work and study. After months of legal wrangling, a federal judge ruled that the estate could be seized, but the provisions should be made for Brennan's surviving family members. The government would recover $1.4 million from the estate, while the remaining $700,000 would be placed in trust for Brennan's grandchildren's education and his widow's care. The resolution of the silent train robbery case became a cautionary tale about the long-term consequences of unsolved crimes. The criminals had not only escaped justice but had lived prosperous lives funded by their illegal activities. Their success had demonstrated that sophisticated criminals could indeed commit the perfect crime, at least from a legal standpoint. The case also revealed the limitations of traditional law enforcement methods. The FBI had investigated the silent train robbery for years using conventional techniques, but they had been unable to solve it because they had been looking for external criminals rather than internal conspirators. The crime had been solved only through the accidental discovery of evidence that the criminals themselves had preserved. For David Chen, the antique dealer who had discovered the briefcase, the case brought both satisfaction and unease. He had helped solve one of the most famous unsolved crimes in American history, but he had also learned that the truth was far more complex and morally ambiguous than anyone had imagined. The briefcase itself became a piece of evidence in the FBI's files, its contents serving as a reminder of how criminals could exploit the very systems designed to protect society. The detailed records kept by Harold Brennan had provided investigators with an unprecedented look inside a sophisticated criminal organization, revealing methods and techniques that would inform law enforcement training for years to come. In the end, the silent train robbery had been solved not through brilliant detective work or advanced technology, but through the simple human tendency to document important events. Harold Brennan had kept detailed records of his criminal activities, perhaps out of pride, perhaps out of paranoia, or perhaps simply out of habit. Those records had survived for 50 years, hidden in a briefcase that no one had bothered to examine until curiosity finally overcame caution. The case closed with a mixture of triumph and frustration. The mystery had been solved, the criminals identified, and the methods revealed. But justice, in the traditional sense, had been impossible to achieve. The criminals had lived and died as free men, their crimes discovered only after it was too late to hold them accountable. The silent train robbery of 1969 had finally been solved, but its resolution served as a reminder that some victories come too late to matter. The truth had emerged, but the truth alone could not undo 50 years of successful crime or restore the money that had been stolen and laundered beyond recovery. Sometimes the perfect crime really is perfect, saved only by the imperfect tendency of criminals to preserve the evidence of their own success.